Thank you very much, Dr. Nia Burras and your team, immensely proficient team in the US over there, and it's great to be part of this international event. And I just very briefly, we're on a roll today, so I'm just going to thank the Art Workers Guild, this wonderful building we're in, and all their staff very quickly, with a special word to Paul, who's handling the immense complicated business of various cameras and audio and microphones and, stuff I don't understand. And a word to, thanks to Simon Hurst, who is now no longer our events coordinator. This is now Georgia Christea in the front row here. But Simon is also sort of embedded within the Art Workers Guild and has been sort of very helpful in getting all this to work, because this event, as I mentioned earlier, has more technical components than normal because of the link up with TAG-24, as in traditional architecture gathering. So a word of thanks to the TAG team, as I call them, or the taggers more informally. That's our committee. And I think particularly to Victoria, who's the administrative assistant. So she has lots of stuff that some of us don't want to do. And then there's Georgia Christea, who has been completely sort of, it's just been the maestro, I think, of the coordination and all that, with all these human interactions, working out the technicalities and so on. So those are the main thanks, but then, of course, thank you to the speakers who will be coming up here, and to those of you who have come along, particularly with those in the so-called front row, who are supposed to have sort of illuminating questions up their sleeves. But there's enough of us, so you don't have to feel under huge pressure, and you can just relax. So that's, I think, hopefully, I've said it earlier, but the format is essentially a panel of 3 or 4 speakers, then a gap for discussion, then a gap for discussion, a roundup, and then we go and enjoy ourselves and leave everyone over into America to carry on being serious. That's the format. So I'll essentially just get straight on with my talk, which is confronting theory and practice. So with a little bit of projects there, but the principles of imitation. And as befits our theme, I will say very little that is original. So much good sense has already been said, and the problem really we have is that it hasn't been heeded. It's been ignored, and it's easier and more fashionable not to remember what Horace said, the Roman poet, who said, it's actually not such a good idea to make a poor invention compared to staying with imitating what's been done before well. Then we came up with the title of the Imitation Game, because we're trying to convince you that you're here for a good time. And of course, this film treated a very serious issue, a drama about decoding the enigma so that you could help win the war. Our topic is still semi-serious. We still have some important points to make. But I think it's good to remember a figure like Lutyens, who was involved in what he called the great game of architectural composition. And he could do war memorials and be very serious. And then he had an intolerable boyish sense of humor, which I admire greatly. So it's a game, but it's serious. Now, nowadays, we're all familiar with the charge of, if you do traditional stuff, the charge of copying. So pastiche, copying, nostalgia, and so on. And we need to remember that we have, let's say, things on our side. Sorry, I'm getting lost already, which is very strange because, oh yes, I should be reading my script. So the point that I think something's gone out of order, that's what it is. So yes, I was supposed to be here, and this is supposed to be, if I stick to the slides, it'll be easier. This is basically saying that imitation is not the same as copying. Okay, they're often sort of elided. But the thing is that imitation is quite a wide, elastic and supple concept. And copying is just a subset there over on the left. And you go all the way through, as Aristotle set out, very well thought through series of ideas about imitation, which takes you all the way to invention. So, and of course, he also said, necessity is the mother of invention. And this is an important key, because if you have a need, you have heft. You have the invention actually means something and contributes something to society. Whereas if you get novelty that has no need behind it, then it just becomes a kind of gimmick. And so I think you can probably get the idea where I'm going with the next slides, which, well, while we obviously should revere Archimedes, who has a great eureka moment, jumping out of the bath with his solution, we also have the problem that novelty and shock is equated with genius nowadays. It's one of the problems, marketing, consumerism, and so on. So we think, perhaps, that Frank Gehry is a genius because he can do this, invention with, and here he is at work, and he's playing his own game here. And recently, just a month ago, I went to Paris and, among other things, saw the Fondation of Vuitton here by Gehry. And then a few days later, I met someone by chance in London, young architect working at Foster's actually, who said how she was so moved by it, she almost cried. Well, the problem is I almost cried, but for the other reasons, So, the waste, the carbon and everything goes into these gigantic sales, and yet you go in and the actual galleries are just simple black boxes. Rigor, poof. So I actually prefer, if you're going to deal with modern architecture, I prefer practices that are relatively humble, like Allies and Morrison, who see no problem with the tried and the tested and tweaking solutions that work. So that's just some images from Bob Allies there. And the same may be said of perhaps boring things, like the VW Golf, one of the most sold cars in the whole world, where really you can spot the evolution of the car, and it's just an incremental development by which what works gets tweaked and what doesn't work gets thrown out. And it's, of course, an old model. It's not a new thing. So you just look at these chairs, and they tell the same story. So really, I think there's so much wisdom bound up with this straightforward way of proceeding. But of course, people will decry this kind of attitude as old-fashioned or just something you can't do. But it's always kind of strange that us architects are put in this position when, say, a classical musician or a chef or all kinds of other people will be actually applauded for maintaining local and regional traditions and sort of, why do so many of us prefer Italian food that is actually relatively boring compared to some stuff that we might get at McDonald's or whatever. So, and the Rolling Stones, of course, riff off Muddy Waters et al., shamelessly, and everyone loves it. So we're in a bit of a pickle as architects. Anyway, to move on from, we won't talk any more about the modern condition. From now on, we're just talking about what is great about imitation or how to use it. I think it's useful to make a distinction between exemplars or specific precedents on the one hand and principles on the other, so that precedent is a whole body of what's gone before encompasses both. And you can choose which way you go. And of course, they're not either or, because you can look to particular examples while also thinking about the principles. And in certain context, copying, which is, remember, on the left side of our imitation diagram, can be pertinent and justified. And so for various factors in the 18th century, you have the Greek revival sort of combining with Enlightenment culture, and you get a copy of the Athenian monument of Lysistrates appearing in Shropshire in 1770 or whatever. And this might be rather strange. But of course, there is also an element of pleasure in this, because Stuart, who would have drawn the original monument, would have been enjoying his memories and all of that while producing this, and it would have been enjoyable to his patron. And this reminds us of something else, that imitation is not just about learning and progress and using the tried and tested. It's also about memory and culture, because if we connect with the past, that life is more meaningful and we can have more conversations with others. And by connecting with the past, we're implying we're going to do the same in the future. So it's all part of a continuum. But my own interests, I should say, are very much tied up with antiquity. And in antiquity, Greek and Roman architects hardly ever copied in that way that we've just seen Stuart do in Shropshire. Occasionally you will find a monument like the column of Marcus Aurelius on the right copy the column of Trajan on the left, while adapting it and improving it and critiquing it. But this is very, very rare. For the most part, Greek and Roman buildings were sort of generated from principles, and they were widely understood. And the Vitruvian Man, here represented by Leonardo da Vinci, is a sort of classic example. 6 foot wide, 6 foot tall, bisected in the middle by a 3-foot line right at the naughty bits and the junction between the limbs and the torso, you understand. And then the navel is splitting the body as 2 to 3, which means the distance between is 1 to 10, and so is the hand, and so is the face, and so it all kind of makes sense, is part of this sort of cosmic model. So, sorry, just to say that there are Greek metrological reliefs in stone that tell you that this is not just an idle concept. And there are statues that obey these principles. But of course, statues look different because their hands and faces and various characteristics, their poses, are different, and people are different. It's quite obvious, really, when you think about it, but we all share the same DNA and so much else. So there is the paradox of sameness yet difference, which is one of the most sort of not commonly understood aspects of imitation that I think is possibly the most important of all, and runs through classicism. And in my own work on the orders, I've probably done this in another talk. So basically, there is a method there with semi-standardization and coherence and proportional coordination, along with variety in things like Roman Corinthian columns. And then you can prove it quite easily, because you look at these capitals there in that grid, and there could be many more. Just see how different they are. They're Greek, Hellenistic, Roman. They're canonic, composite, and deviant, if you like, or variant. And yet all of them fit the same simple rule, 1-to-1, rather like Vitruvian Man. The width of the capital on the cross-section at the top there in red equals its height. And that goes right across production, say from Greek to Byzantine. So when someone like myself or my practice of Polydorus architecture comes to doing a building like this one on the right, I would go, let's just get a piece of paper out and do it from principles and memory and what one's learnt, without going to look at a particular example. And some people would say, well, why waste your time when you can go and get the example? And we can have a debate about this. Personally, I quite like getting the principle and then seeing what comes up. Then you compare it with the other guys, what's been done before, and then you tweak it and you try and find something that is going to work, maybe, in that sunlight or whatever. And the same with the plan of the building. The main building which this forms part is, you could generally call it Palladian-ish, but we wouldn't take one of Palladius Villas and then sort of amend it. You start with a grid, you build it up, there's context and function and all kinds of things, and you come up with a plan. And an image, and then all this work goes into trying to soften it and nestle it into the landscape. And one of Victoria's images with watercolor and graphic renders all at the same time. This ends up being the result, and the kind of things that I like playing with, actually this is an out of focus side, so we can move on, but basically playing with symmetries and asymmetries, alignments, non-alignments, you get a more interesting result. Well, I think you could just about make it out, but here's the typical 3/3, but this is 4/3, and that's 3/2. And the point is that they shift and align when you see them from different angles, and it gives the building a dynamic quality, and that's what someone like myself learns from the Pantheon. So in a way, it's a Pantheon-inspired building, but it looks nothing like the Pantheon, and that's drawings did to sort of work these things out. So similarly, that vault is necessarily shallow to fit in there. It may remind you of a vault by Soane or Schinkel, but that wasn't the source, because it's just been decorated according to what we of the team worked out about Roman wall painting principles. But then, of course, with all this talk of high elevated principles, there is also some copying, and none of us are the most brilliant figure painters. So when designing this 500 meters squared of wall painting alla Romana, we have to borrow. Right, so you go to Pompeii and you borrow, and then you pass the information over to the painters, team of 6 painters in this case, and then they will do their own version. And then to conclude, really, a little look at a sort of different kind of copying by a little game we had with the work of Adolf Loos. Now, this is the Loos building, so-called in Vienna, and it's kind of straddling the modern and the classical. And there's the similarly iconic bar, the American bar, but also called the Loos Bar, which is in the same city. And this is about the same size as the project we had to do, which is an installation in a marble fair. But we thought, as in the spirit of emulation, to go one better, by which I mean that the marble coffers, in their turn inspired by the Pantheon, became made out of one sheet of marble and became translucent, and then you get the backlighting, and that's the result. So it's, this kind of thing is really good. Now I now have 1 minute, which is perfect, because I only need 30 seconds. So here, basically, to just conclude with this thing we talked about earlier with, let's say, shock and novelty, and the idea that you generate stuff. It's typical in contemporary architecture not to have a genuine backstory. You're told that the schemes are generated out of principles or genius concepts, narratives, but actually no one talks about the fact that, of course, we are all influenced by each other's work. And so I think in the traditional movement, we're actually quite happy to honour our sources and to say, we got it from Loos, we got it from the Pantheon, we got it from wherever. And on that note, I would just like to say, these are some of the books that I've been using, and I recommend them to you anyway. Well, actually, the top left is just, I think, a YouTube cover, so you can get your Aristotle via YouTube as well, or you can work through some of these texts of, all the way to the most recent, which is written by the gentleman in Edward McParland, who's graced us with his presence today. I'm so pleased. And he doesn't have Imitation in the title, but it is the title of chapter 2. And then a mention just to lead in possibly to the next. I'm setting Ross Sharpe up to a fall here. You see, there's the word pastiche there in the book by Francis Terry. Now, is Ross going to be doing pastiche or not? So over to Ross, who's the next one in this role in the imitation game.
Right, how do we get this thing started? Okay, thank you, Mark, for that great opening. Slightly playful about what I'm going to be talking about. Here we go. So, a simple definition of the word eclectic is deriving ideas, style, or taste from a broad and diverse range of sources. Now, I confess I was a little bit worried about coming here today to talk about a description that can be troublesome for a lot of art historians, cultural commentators, and even Mark's initial suggestion to me that the challenge of eclecticism seemed to denote some difficulty or discomfort with this concept. I would like instead to propose, by explaining my own philosophy about this and looking at some work over the last few years, that no, there is no real challenge in eclecticism, but more of an opportunity for richness, delight, and stimulation. Now, it's hard for me to know how to open this slot, but you know, the answer was literally staring me in the face. For the last 10 years, I've been looking at this very imaginative piece of woodwork over the fireplace in my study in remotest West Somerset. It's an oak overmantel, and it's confirmed as a genuine 17th century piece. At first, I thought it was Jacobean, but I now think it's a bit later and probably dates from between 1625 and 1640, or slap bang in the middle of the reign of Charles I, a monarch who we might normally associate with the likes of John Webb and Inigo Jones, and the very earliest of the Palladian revivals in England. But this piece is not in the slightest bit Palladian. It's a characteristic combination of so many of the themes, both mysterious and yet utterly comprehensible to the mind of the man who carved it, possibly armed with his handed-down impressions of Serlio by some artisan mentor, but more probably a salient knowledge of some of the barbaric exemplars of Wiedemann de Vries or Hans Dieterlen. Yes, I would say this is a piece of eclecticism with a capital E. Now look at this relatively humble composition. There's that assured decorated arch, but with his naive interpretation of the fluted pilasters holding on simple bands top and bottom, and the actual unentased columns holding up the frieze have that crisply blocked rustication typical of the period. The spandrels are not foliated, but contain tightly packed geometric motifs of bullseyes and tiny bits of strapwork. Okay, pages, okay. Tiny bits of strapwork we come to associate with so much English decoration of the period. Then the entablature, with its naive console brackets framing an almost surreally stylized Mantimian motif, just runs out of the projection with any resolution. It seems almost wild, playful, and full of invention, and notwithstanding the iconographic rules of the day, it is the essence of what I would call eclectic. The period of its manufacture, with that particularly unbounded use of what we might call classical language, causes quite a lot of unease to historians of the classical revival. Yet there may be just as many original 16th or 17th century pieces like this around the country as there are politely and correctly proportioned fireplaces following the manner of a Gibbs or a Payne or a Robert Adam. Now this fact has always fascinated me. And what was it about the mind of that slightly unrestrained, more eclectic Caroline carpenter who made him so intensely comfortable and assured about using such a diverse range of ideas? Was eclecticism such a challenge to him, and should it be for us? Our built architectural projects over the last 30 years or so are, I suppose, the result of some cross-pollination between memory, interpretation, small but precious fragments of knowledge, and the great enjoyment of the creative process. I'd like to think that all of these influences have colluded in some way to produce work that is eminently picturesque but undeniably eclectic, albeit in quite different ways. We've always been compelled by this country's very peculiar native and material-based design traditions, which I believe have been instrumental in the formation of an eclectic vocabulary. We've also found the sheer madness of so many of the country's delightful and wonky reworkings of an indigenous vernacular tradition almost as enjoyable to look at as its taking of more archaeologically correct sources of design and subverting and corrupting them in remarkable ways. So in describing a few buildings here, I apologize in advance for our own, someone might say, very deliberate attempts at a picturesque eclecticism. And the first project I'd like to show you has some resonance with that overmantel in my home. Yangu is a Cotswold practice. We are very fortunate in working in one of the most beautiful corners of Britain, surrounded by glorious building stone and some of the most charming buildings in the land. An architectural tradition here blossomed as a result of the wealth generated by the wool trade between the 15th and 18th centuries. So mindful of these localized material and design precedents, I began to design the substantial new house on a bucolic site on the edge of an Oxfordshire village. Now, originally, our client had wanted a classical house, commissioning schemes from some eminent British architects, but pressure from the Conservation Design Officer about the appropriateness of this type of building made us rethink the design and imagine a house which took its cues from the Cotswold tradition: gables, bands of mullioned transom windows, accurately detailed finials and chimneys. But there are more elaborate parts of the building. In the doorway and in the fireplaces, you can perhaps see the way that the Northern European pattern book tradition so widely apparent in the prodigy houses and many smaller manor houses that proliferate in this part of the world, is incorporated. Yes, in a sense, these are our reworkings of an already reworked language, but the house does have a very distinctive historicist spirit, which alludes to another Cotswold tradition, that of the real arts and crafts of Barnsley and Jimson in the early 20th centuries. So maybe indeed it is an eclectic composition. Here's another fireplace. It's a little architectural arrangement in its own right, a stylized construction which combines Baroque and neoclassical elements and creates quite an exuberant atmosphere in the hallway of this new house, which was designed about the same time. It's quite a well-known design of Hughes. It's very Cotswold again, but in a later 17th century double-pile tradition. However, the house is far from conventional. It is in fact overlaid with a variety of progressively more sophisticated architectural motifs, part of the desire for the house to be read as a palimpsest, or a building which has been subtly reworked over time. In detail, there are more manorist parts, and on some elevations, a more European neoclassicism, which speaks directly to the owner's heritage and the family's other historic homes in Prussia. In my own mind, this is an eclectic building, but its subtle hue comes from that wonderful stone quarried almost beside the house, making it a building that couldn't really be in any other part of the world. It is very English, yet it has no real parallel in the country. Now, stone is a wonderful, very durable and extremely sustainable material, and throughout the UK, we have used stone extensively in many of our buildings which look historically conventional, but are in fact much more eclectic than first reading. Here's the front porch frieze. The iconography is modern, and the representations on the paterae are uniquely pertinent to the owner. The wing radiating off what appears to be a straightforward new house in the English Baroque style of, say, Smith or Warwick, contains references to a more abstract neoclassicism in the incised geometric decoration. In a new house in the north of England, which uses a sandstone instead of a limestone, the porch has the crude sophistication of the early 17th centuries, with a flavour of the mighty Lutyens in his liberal use of classical detail, which was part of his eclectic high game. On occasions, we've taken our love of late 19th and early 20th century architecture and created very special small buildings, like this new music room in Worcestershire. The eclecticism here is in juxtaposition, defying opposition from the local design officer, and with a client whose extensive knowledge of British design, furniture and craft of the period was exemplary, we designed a structure which attempted to distinguish itself completely from the 17th century hunting boxes attached to it and everything but the beautiful handmade imperial bricks. The references here are to be spotted. The architecture of Philip Webb is fused with oblique references to Mackintosh. And in the interiors, the reverence for simple, craft-based motifs and the availability locally of the finest building materials and craftsmen actually creates a space of unity and tranquility, a different kind of eclectic experience. Yangu architects have been very lucky to have some remarkable clients. Few, however, can own one of the rare survivals of a substantial house by one of the country's quirkiest and most influential pattern book designers and architects, Batty Langley. So here's the twist: to build a new dower house on an estate which itself might take quotations from an early 18th century purveyor of even older antiquities. This new house is thus one of the most obviously eclectic, and it's the greatest delight to us that within its walls is now contained an original copy of the Langley tome we were given to study by the owner. Although a fragment of an older 18th century barn remains to one side, it is an entirely new house which juxtaposes a more restrained and conventional new villa with its polite wide eaves and fine glazing bars, with a little castellated centrepiece containing the new principal staircase connecting all parts of the interior. The detail is our homage to Batty Langley's innocent Gothic language, but it's not a literal representation, it is more of a mood, and in this respect matches the entirely mood-provoking reaction of the Georgian mind to the world of Horace Walpole and his contemporaries. Now, there might be a room full of classicists here, and I apologise, but before I go on to talk about the Oxford project, I'd like to show you another building which entirely embraces the material tradition of its setting, and also an interesting genre in this country's architectural and stylistic development. 50 or so years after the innovative yet naive and slightly errant visions of Batty Langley and his disciples, this country had become very enamoured with the picturesque movement. Indeed, the scores of pattern books which were published on the subject of lodges and garden buildings started a real trend for what we now refer to as the cottage ornée movement, and the word cottage is not always a particularly accurate description. Here in the banks of the River Test, we imagined a house in this manner, and indeed the Gothic elements are all there, along with the carved barge boards, exactly as one would see in the work of Loudon or Robinson or Plaw. But this is a house which also reads as a palimpsest, a building which has grown over time, with elaborate bay windows facing the river, curiously baronial tower, the Edwardian loggia, all perhaps conspiring to evade a true date for the house. With an interior, convincing as a whole by the evocative, almost Gothic and Jacobean detailing of a lot of its woodwork. This is a building where the eclecticism is far more of a temporal variety. Designed at one piece, the house appears to have a history of over 100 years or more. Being asked to design a new public-facing entrance to a historic Oxford college could be a daunting prospect. I was very conscious of all the things that modesty said should not be attempted, as well as all the criticism I could face from onlookers saying, oh, I wouldn't have done it that way. The great joy in this exercise came from the client, Ralph Waller, the college principal, who gave the most perfect brief to design a jewel for the city, and from the brilliantly creative Oxford City design officer, Nick Whirlwind, who dared to defy conventional modernist dogma. Now, it is with a really heavy heart I have to conclude that there would be practically no chance of such a historicist statement being built in the city now, even though we've done a few more discrete things nearby. Harris Manchester College isn't very old. It's one of those 19th century establishments, but it's in a very visible part of the city and has enormous dowdy buildings in a crushing, muscular Gothic style. Much as I love Gothic, I do not love these buildings, which have a scale and awkwardness alien to the city. My thought was to produce a much more delicate piece, which sought to straddle the old refaced medieval buildings of Holywell Street and the later Victorian Mansfield Road. This is a project with many architectural references, but at the heart of things was the desire for the tower, the gabled range beside it, and the new gateway to be highly contextual. A set of listed buildings were demolished to make way for the project, which I see as a rather personal, slightly reverential tribute to the very tangible, eclectic contribution to the Oxford streetscape by those architects like Thomas Jackson and Basil Champneys over a period of 30 years in the latter part of the 19th century. The tower contains student rooms. It transitions from a strong rusticated base by means of stories defined by cornice details, all faithfully derived from my old copy of Normand. There's a passing nod to the Baroque of Oxford and the strongly architrave windows, and a reference to the atmospheric 16th century Sharrington's Tower at Laycock Abbey, a truly remarkable and early piece of English classicism. But it's made less literal with the series of Ionic columns of the Bassai order, beloved by that other Oxford architect, Charles Cockerell, and with the correct round bases. The gate itself is our deferential take on Michelangelo's mannerism, but surmounting that most beloved of our native classical arch frames, which are such a prolific English model and indeed go back to my overmantel in Somerset. The tower, as you imagine, in a city with its fair share of dreary, conventionally trained modernists, utterly divides opinion. The public seem to love it, the intellectuals hate it. It is eclectic, the reference points are truly transparent. We hope it's a unique building, which, to quote an American architect friend, seemed to him to be more Oxford than Oxford. When he asked me to contribute to today's proceedings, I think Mark might have been curiously sceptical about what we've been doing all over these years. But it has been gratifying that several of these projects have been the recipients of awards from a wide variety of organisations, including the RIB and the Georgian Group. Now, however these organisations have judged things, I believe there's a common denominator in that they are all eclectic, both in a broader definition of that description in a postmodern cultural landscape, but more important for me, they are eclectically composed, using that wide variety of sources as reference points for the composition. Now, I, for one, would not be practising if I felt that new buildings could not be created by an approach that favours selective, well-defined points of departure without overreaching the boundaries of an equally well-defined historical or geographical landscape. That is to say, in terms of localised building traditions and materials, and also in the way that certain motifs and idioms have been promoted for centuries around the country. A final couple of images will show that even in our modernist projects, that reference to local materiality and even historic plan form are not abandoned. Here is in the new buildings in rural Yorkshire on a country estate, in Oxfordshire in a beautiful town, and all designed about 10 years ago. I hope there's an almost picturesque relationship of buildings to their historic setting. As an eclectic architect, one runs the risk of damnation. I know modernist friends or colleagues who are perplexed about purity. I also know that classically minded colleagues are maybe similarly perplexed. But I do not believe eclecticism is about ignorance or limited imaginations or boundaries, nor it is about callous manipulation after the fact. No civilizing branches have been torn from the great tree of architectural worthiness. Thoughtful eclecticism is, to my mind, about creating delight, and I have the greatest joy in both revering the wonderful resources available to us all, as well as that slightly anarchic satisfaction in not being defined as belonging to one polarizing camp or another. Here is in our new buildings in an Oxford college, which really shouldn't have been built. I hope the carpenter who designed and made that overmantel nearly 400 years ago just had a similar joy in using his knowledge and his imagination without the need to apologize. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all, organizers, hosts, colleagues, for inviting me and for organizing this event. We have the first slide. Oh, I have to do that. Okay. There we are. Since our theme today is imitation, I thought I would reflect for a few minutes on what is perhaps the most literal form of imitation, that being reconstruction. The goal of a reconstruction is the restitution on the same site of a valued historic structure or place damaged or destroyed by natural hazards, accident, war, or human stupidity. The aim of reconstruction is to imitate the historical conditions as closely as possible, though there may still be a role for design. I'll suggest some different motives to the practice and show some examples. One of the most inspiring places I know is the Abbey of Monte Cassino on a mountaintop halfway between Rome and Naples. The abbey was bombed by the Allies in February 1944, utterly destroying the church and its monastic complex. The Italian architect, urbanist, restorer, and historian Gustavo Giovannoni led the discussions that resulted in the abbey being reconstructed dov'era com'era, where it was as it was. The restorers also refashioned the magnificent interior of the church, integrating surviving historic fabric with new paintings and ornament completed only in the 1980s. In Giovannoni's words, "The old architectural scheme, reproduced more or less faithfully, can obtain a rich and harmonious effect such as to leave us no longer mourning what was lost." In addition to the strict reconstruction, the architects made a few improvements, including adding a facade to the formerly unfinished front of the church and opening up an arcade to give the courtyard a view of the landscape outside. So while it was a strict reconstruction, there was also a freedom of design to finish some bits that had been left unfinished previously. The historic center of Warsaw, deliberately destroyed by the Nazis, was reconstructed based on surviving drawings and paintings and is now recognized itself as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A visit to Warsaw, which I highly recommend if you haven't been there, is a moving experience, presenting us with Gothic and Renaissance buildings completed in the 1950s. Nothing removes the pain of loss, but the new center offers at least a partial healing, and it represents an excellent example of reconstruction on a truly urban scale. Dresden, too, is an example of reconstruction as a form of healing. But hundreds of cities and towns throughout Europe have been rebuilt after the wars of the 20th century, and many visitors are probably not aware of how new these historic centers are. Aside from wars, there have also been important reconstructions after fires, such as Windsor Palace, the Glasgow School of Art, and now Notre Dame in Paris. The first motive for reconstruction, therefore, is restitution of lost heritage. This is not a strictly architectural issue, but a broadly cultural one, involving the values, memory, and identity of communities. In addition to restitution, Notre Dame in Paris reveals a second motive. Reconstruction is an important means of training architects, engineers, builders, craftsmen, and artists in the intangible heritage needed to undertake such work and to keep those skills alive. After the fire, you might recall, many claimed that the reconstruction of the cathedral's roof was impossible because the specialized knowledge, the craft skills, and the oak timbers were all unavailable. In the end, not only was it possible, thanks in part to the compagnonnage du devoir, keeping the medieval crafts alive in France, which for some reason contemporary designers were unaware of, but the project is training a new generation of specialists to join the robust French conservation system, which other countries would do well to imitate. More imitation. The third motive for reconstruction I'd like to share with you is that it returns to us models of durability and sustainability that we can then apply to the construction of new development. Reconstruction of historic buildings that were already sustainable can serve as a kind of reverse engineering to learn the materials, methods, and principles needed to build sustainably again. As the French writer Françoise Chouet has written, quote, "We restore in order to recapture our capacity to build," end quote. I've simplified it slightly to a slogan which we might adopt and carve in marble somewhere. We restore in order to learn how to build. Attitudes toward reconstruction are changing. In New York City, for example, the reconstruction of Pennsylvania Station, which was torn down famously in 1963 and 4, is now seriously being proposed as an alternative to conventional schemes that raise problems of scale and cost. While the project has broad public support, the professional community, not surprisingly, resists it. The resistance derives in part from the fear of inaccuracy and inauthenticity. This is not necessarily an unfounded concern. In the 1930s reconstruction of the 18th century colonial Capitol building at Williamsburg, Virginia, the architects in some instances allowed their aesthetic convictions to override the archaeological evidence. Secure documentation, use of historic materials and methods, and a subtle but clear distinction between historic and invented elements can prevent this kind of confusion. A more severe problem for reconstruction arose from the modern movement. Le Corbusier's Siam Charter of 1933 draws a sharp break between the architecture of the past and that of the present, making only grudging room for conservation. Reconstruction runs contrary to the modernist program. Seems pretty obvious. Something you might not know about, maybe a little less familiar than the Siam Charter, is a 1938 instruction to architects and restorers from the Italian fascist government banning the use of historic styles in either conservation or new design, calling it, quote, a double falsification with respect to both the ancient and the recent history of art, end quote. Any work to complete missing elements in style were also banned. New traditional and reconstructed buildings were considered falsifications because they deny the radical discontinuity between the past and the present still assumed by much of the architectural conservation community. The post-war Italian restoration theorist Cesare Brandi denounced as fakes the reconstruction of the Campanile of St. Mark in Venice after its 1901 collapse, and the rebuilding of Trinità Bridge in Florence after its destruction by the Nazis. For Brandi, no building or structure can be reproduced or copied without falsification, which amounts to the application of the standards for paintings and sculptures to buildings and cities. There is also wide divergence between public sentiment and expert opinion on this issue. The conservation of modern heritage is treated as an exception to the rules. The temporary Barcelona pavilion was reconstructed as restitution of its form as a modernist icon, but to my knowledge, no one has denounced it as a fake. Have they? I'm glad to hear it. At least they're consistent. We know what the official documents say. The Venice Charter of 1964, familiar to everyone in the room, I imagine, does outright ban reconstruction at archaeological sites, but is rather ambivalent on other possibilities. Something you may be less familiar with, the 2011 Valletta Principles of ICOMOS, makes an important shift and focuses on the urban scale. Quote, priority must be given to a continuity of composition that does not adversely affect the existing architecture, end quote. That's a much more positive approach. The city is no longer a collection of isolated specimens, each representing its date of construction, but a collective work of art changing over time. Official pronouncements still seek to limit reconstructions to special circumstances, but documents like the Valletta Principles, the Borough Charter, and the Nara Declaration represent a gradual opening. The recent document, Historic England's Approach to Reconstruction of Heritage Assets, properly sets out criteria for evaluating individual proposals on a case-by-case basis. In this more accepting environment, many authorities now recognize reconstruction as a legitimate conservation treatment when the previous state of the site is well documented, there is no danger of damage to historic fabric, the proposal has the support of the community whose heritage the place is, and the damage or destruction itself is not considered part of the cultural significance of the place. The Berliner Schloss, brilliantly reconstructed by my Notre Dame University colleague, I'm proud to say Thomas Albrecht and his team, is, personal opinion, diminished by Franco Stella's minimalist insertions in relation to the three reconstructed Baroque facades. What if that fourth facade were a newly designed composition imitating Schluter's 18th century work without being a copy? Such a new design, subtly distinguished from the others, would represent a new partnership, recognizing a design element in conservation and a conservation element in design. Gustavo Giovannoni, whom I mentioned earlier, devoted his career to reconciling conservation and the design of new buildings and cities. He argued in favor of the reconstruction of monuments lost to war, fire, and other tragedies for the sake of restitution of heritage, training in crafts, and preservation of models for future building. In an anthology that will be released by Getty Publications this July, excerpts from his extensive writings will be available in English for the first time. I invite you to take a look at this new resource for architecture, urbanism, and conservation alike. And if you'll allow me, I've left some announcements of the book on the table there in front. Please help yourself to any of those. I see that my time has elapsed, so I will thank you again for the invitation and wish you a good meeting carrying forward. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk. I don't know whether we're running late. Have I got my 15 minutes? Okay, yeah, sorry. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, TAG. I don't know, I guess I have my 15 minutes. I don't know how long it will be, but let's go. So, yeah, I want to come at this from a slightly different angle, not kind of trying to justify reconstruction or mimesis in a way, but really from a point of view of mimesis in a sense of representation of the world around us is relevant to all of us as architects, whether we come from a modernist or a traditional or classical tradition. And thank you. Yeah, so the preoccupation of architects today is really quite angst-ridden, in a sense that we're all preoccupied with what is the shape of the future. There's an obsession that's born out of a central belief that, you know, we all have to be innovative, and what's going on today has to be relevant to a vague and just round the corner future. and everybody's looking for that alchemy that is able to reproduce a future with all technology, or with technology that's immediately, if you like, rendered redundant because it's transient, as we can see with everything that's invented around us. So I want to propose that it's really to do with a way of looking at the world. It's a Weltanschauung. It's a worldview, and where your sensibilities lie that defines whether you are representing a mode of being or a mode of construction. I always collected, sort of interesting tidbits from different architects just to see what it means, and I always thought that they were disingenuous, until I came to the conclusion that really it comes out of a genuine belief. Nobody says things like this lightly, except maybe for the advert where it says the best looking windows are those you can't see. So that wants the architecture to disappear and just focus on the commodity. The one on the left, from a very famous firm of architects, obviously says something that you can see in the context of the foreground. You're in the north of England somewhere, and that's the kind of climate. But then you design something that you have to reverse engineer in order to make it fight the climate, or the reduction of context into surface treatments. So architects today are this kind of jolly figure of the 17th century French dancing between two paradigms. One is Logier's paradigm, if you like, or paradigm that's a legacy of classicism, and the other one is today. So these two paradigms, they really respond two different responses. That's where I come from, I guess. It's an approach to representation. It's not really copying. It's an approach to representation of a sensibility that goes beyond mimicry, beyond copying, beyond copyright, behind all of those things which are causing angst. Beyond, everybody's worried about AI today because everybody's worried about intellectual property. Intellectual property is a worry because once intellect becomes a commodity, the architectural idea becomes a commodity, you have to protect your right, you have to protect your commodity. So if you detach yourself from that, you're kind of liberated from these ideas. So you can see that Reconstruction in traditional architecture has resonance in terms of memory. It has resonance in terms of bringing back community, and the kind of the opposite, which is a dissonance in a way. So you can see here, like the reconstruction which Stephen showed of various parts of the world. You've got the Fraukirche, obviously, and then you've got Dresden, and the important thing really to realize is that the act of copying is not really an act of copying for me. It is about convergence. Once you start representing the ideals and the idea of the machine, of exactitude, all of the things that are at the basis of modernism that we were taught, of traditional modernism, I suppose an oxymoron, but that really forces you to make representation in such a way that ends up in mimicry. And then it becomes a meta-mimicry in a way that it becomes fashionable. But then the source of that inspiration, or if that of that representation and of those sensibilities still there. So these buildings in different parts of the world all really aspire to be very clean, well-designed machines. And that's the aesthetic that they're trying to represent. The barcode game on the facade, or the earlier slide that I showed, which was putting a pattern on the facade in order to contextualize it, is all to do with how a machine would inhabit the world, rather than something that is bound with human scale and human sensibility. In the same way that you can see different vernacular architectures of different parts of the world, from very diverse geographic spread, converge. The reason they converge is not because they're imitating each other. In fact, when they were constructed, or the time they were constructed, and the fact that they're still being constructed, there was no social media, There's no treaties. There's no written rules about how to do things in different parts of the world. But the contingencies of human existence, the way one would react and act with nature, basically forces you to do things in a certain way. If you're building a grain store or a rice, you have to lift it up from the ground it sits on. And that is common through different architectures in different regions. The way you build a thatch roof, whether it is in the Caucasus or northern Iran, is exactly the same as you would do in the Cotswolds. So this is not really an act of mimicry. It cannot be explained by kind of quasi-intellectual ideas about what mimesis might be. It comes out of the contingency of counteracting, interacting, and actually struggling with nature, the same way adobe architecture works in different deserts, in different conditions in different parts of the world, or timber frame architecture you get from the Levant to southern England or northern England, for that matter. So we try to examine these things in kind of various projects to see how, when we travel and when we're working within a specific context, how that interacts with the brief that we're given, with the type of project or architectural expression that we are to contend with. This is a project, for instance, in Kuwait of a villa that's very introverted. It has a lot of fenestration, but it's not really open to the world. It has what they call masharabiyas and sits on a plot. It's built out of stone with a cool interior courtyard, and the sensuousness, the solid forms with recesses which almost look like with windows from a distance to give you the shadows, and kind of the interplay on large flat surfaces that you need to have because you cannot elaborate it in the facade with any kind of fenestration, or a new chalet that we built in the Alps at the elevation of 2000 almost in 1860, where you can't really kind of joke with nature when there's 2 meters of snow on your roof. So it makes you express the architecture. It makes you do things in a certain way. You either have the sensibility of the machine and you say, I have built this beautiful electric Tesla that can go through snow and it can defy nature, or you can say, well, I have built an object that is at one with nature. It rises out of nature. It's stone when it comes off the ground, and when it has to bear a heavy weight of snow, it can deal with it in the way nature intended. So the slates are 5 or 16 centimeter thick. They're the sizes of Yorkstone slabs, and that allows you to that allows the building with the deep reveals or the deep overhangs to contend with forces of nature. The same thing with projects in Spain. I will quickly flick through. This is an equestrian project that we've been working on in Spain for quite a while. It's kind of temporarily halted, quite a large project. Again, an exploration of vernacular and how that relates using local materials with local stone and local language of architecture, which sits well within the natural surroundings and the way people have inhabited that part of the world in ages. And a project probably in a little bit more detail. This is a country house we found on the island Jura in Scotland, where the main house was a very modest building that you can see in there, and steadings, which were a series of cowsheds. And we found the ruins, really, and in order to reimagine this as a building, we used the language of the existing building. So that's a view of the building itself as it was finished, and as it sits on the promontory with 2 wings added to the and that's the original building. And it was extended quite extensively with wings to the east and to the west in the similar language, reimagined of the existing, using the methods and the construction techniques with which the original building was built in stone, and really reimagining how it would have been conceived had it been a blank site with the clues of the existing meaning. You can see how the weathering of the stone belies what is new and what is existing. And the steadings, which were really a kind of a series of cowsheds, and they would look like this when we got to them in various states of disrepair. And we reimagined them really as a series of buildings that we used as part of the state, using local materials, fieldstone, which was literally found around the site, constructed in load-bearing construction with Harling and various renders. And I think my time's up. Oh, I finished 1 minute early. Thank you so much.
Well, finishing 1 minute early makes Alireza the star of the show, really. And so we're just that little bit nearer to keeping on time. And what we have to do is fairly quickly, those of us who spoke, we move over to there. The camera angle will change. And we can, the microphones, though, I can't see them. Paul, where's Paul? Oh, they're there. Oh, they're on the individual seats. Right. Okay. So all of us grab a microphone, and then you guys out there provoke us with stunning questions. Observations, interjections, denials, delight. Right.
Hello, hello.
So we. Oh, good, good. Is that working? Yes. So we have a problem in the sense that we don't have a moderator that doesn't coincide with one of the speakers. So there's no fairness here. It's just a simple, I think, sort of a first come, first served basis. So do we have any observations? I think first of the speakers, is there anything that you would like to say about one of the other talks that you think needs to be said before we engage the wider audience?
Well, Mark, I feel a little bit out of order here because, is this on? Are you hearing it?
I think they're on. Maybe we just need to...
Can you hear now?
Yes, I think...
A little bit better. Okay, I'll pretend I'm a rock singer and I'll keep the microphone really close. I was just saying I feel a little bit out of order because my talk was flanked by two architects showing actual buildings they designed, and I didn't show any buildings I designed. I have designed buildings, but I didn't show them. So what I feel obligated to do is to say how much I enjoyed the work that both of these gentlemen showed, and how it ties in with a thought I had earlier today. I spent the morning walking around Bloomsbury, which is a part of London that I've grown very attached to, and just thinking for the umpteenth time, not a new thought, how is it that we've been able to make environments like this all over the world, and yet for the last 75 years or so, we have intransigently refused to make more of them? Now, with exceptions, for example, my colleagues to left and right of me have been making more of the kinds of environments that people actually pay money to go and visit because they can't live in one. I mean, they could live in one, and many of us are involved in creating new places where people might live that have the same qualities as a Georgian square, maybe. It's one possibility. So I just want to say how important it is that there are people who are resisting the resistance of our colleagues who have a very different vision of the future.
Yeah, no, very good point. Thank you, Stephen. So I think we should just throw it open to the floor. Yes, we have a question or observation. It can be anything from over there. Victoria will pass you the microphone.
Thanks. I think just picking up on that point, what I thought was interesting was how the various talks this evening could be seen as an invitation for the wider profession who perhaps don't have traditional education to a way of opening a door or creating a bridge. And I thought the quote about necessity being the mother of invention could be a starting point, in that vernacular architecture is using generally pre-industrial, low-carbon technology to create pleasant environments, or habitable environments. Then the idea of conservation and reconstruction is a way of learning and acquiring knowledge which maybe isn't so broadly known. I thought the idea of eclectic architecture is fantastic because it gives you permission to try out doing some classical architectural forms that maybe you're not formally trained in and not be so worried about getting it wrong. It could be thought from a non-trained architect that there's some magical formula to doing classical architecture, and I think having a way into it allows you to then become better educated and then find the nuances. But to say that it can be eclectic, I think is very welcoming. And then finally, we can become more fine-tuned in our aesthetic judgments. I'm not sure there's a particular question there, but perhaps more of a reflection.
Thank you. I'm handicapped by the absence of a microphone, but I think it's for TAG members in particular. I think it's very much an aim of ours to try and engage more with the wider profession and with the RIBA and other bodies. We haven't. I mean, I think it takes a little bit of preparation how to do this, and actually, this event might be a stepping stone. And there are a few people in the audience who aren't actually our usual members, and it would be extremely interesting to hear from them how, what they think. In fact, you, if I'm correct, you aren't actually a member yet, but by this evening you may be. So I think that we definitely, I mean, as the committee and with anyone else in the audience or just put the word out there, we'll probably send out some communications. We do want to think how to marshal our talents and abilities and messages into engaging more with the wider profession. I think it's a very necessary thing, because I think part of the problem is there is a kind of binary that's been developing of sort of us against them, or modernism against traditionalism. Of course, there are many people who are actually somewhat in the middle and don't have quite the old school aversion to this. I think, some of the, let's say, very difficult conversations you might have in the 80s, 90s and early 2000s are now actually becoming easier. So anyway, over to someone else.
Jamal, thank you very much for a series of fascinating talks. I'm not an architect, I'm an associate member here. So my question is, what do you think that non-architects can do to help further this movement that we are all agreed in, that we want to see more traditional architecture in our world?
Again, I get the most difficult question. I think, look, at the end of the day, all of these complicated words, not complicated, but words which are within the profession, and we talk about like eclecticism, modernism, all this is about human beings. It's about the human conditions and a humanist architecture. And what we need to do is engender a kind of a debate within the profession, because the profession is closed essentially to outside criticism, especially the establishment, and through initiatives that various bodies have been implementing, like charrettes, community engagement, involving people, create streets, I think is a very good example of that, is the only way of engaging rather than separating itself from its base or from its human condition. Because as I was saying, an architecture that's based on human principles, you know, and the kind of old Vitruvian triadic principles of commodity, firmness, and delight, which delivers for human scale, needs to feed on the response of humans. Whereas an architecture that doesn't rely on that and works to a different kind of condition and set of principles doesn't really need to go back to the community. The only reason it's doing now is for political expediency, and not really in order out of any kind of genuine concern. I think the debate has shifted, as Mark said. In the 1980s, urban planning was a completely dominated modernist exercise. And gradually, traditional urban design, neighborhoods, walkable neighborhoods, multi-surface, multi-layered neighborhoods which are not zoned, anti-zoning laws, these have all been creeping back because of human beings who want to live, work in the same vicinity. They want environments which are human. And I think by being engaged with organizations which bridge the gap between the profession, the building trade, the developers, and the profession, and the people is really the only way to engage.
I think sorry, Stephen, just one other thing. I think it's also necessary for us to engage more with schools of architecture because, of course, young people are the future. And we did have this open table discussion, as it was called, a couple of months ago, with showcasing a whole load of summer schools that are sort of sprouting up around the world. And that's very interesting. I think we have to try and persuade or convince schools of architecture to, there are some who have at least a unit here and there, and we have to try and get that to become more normal, more accepted, and that's another way that things can improve over the long term.
Could I just very briefly thank you for your question and just try to give a simple answer? You said, what can non-architects do? I think non-architects are the most important people in this equation because architects can do nothing by themselves. Architects need clients and patrons, and they need a public that supports them or not. And so one of the things you can do is really be part of the demand side of the equation, if you will. Demand quality environments from the architects and the builders and the politicians and everyone else who is involved in the building culture of your country, your place. So thank you for that, and I think it's an important reminder. We architects tend to talk about ourselves all the time and forget that there's a whole world out there that either supports us or not.
Hello, I speak as a non-architect. I spent 6 weeks in architectural school, and making wash drawings of the Doric order were beyond me. So I got out, and I became an architectural historian, which I think is relevant in an answer to the last question. I think that the architectural historian has a role different simply from the public client who might be involved with comment at the planning stage or the owner or giving a brief, different from the profession. I think the architectural historian ideally should be an architect. That would be an enormous advantage if I had another 7 years to spare to become an architect. But as a historian, I think one has something to say as a critic, as somebody who is regarded sometimes by the profession of architecture as an outsider, but who in self-satisfied moments feels that the architectural historian has a perception, particularly of the classical system, which is very rare among architects.
Yes, we have to wind up this session, but I would say that this came from Edward McParland, who is the author of that book, if you remember in my slide with all the books in, the latest one. And I've just, I was looking for it actually only yesterday. It's just behind there, because I had bought it in advance of this evening. and then I couldn't find it anymore. And Jacob Ring, who's the other part with Victoria, who's part-time, of Polydorus architecture, when I showed it to him, had just taken it, and it's now in Poland. And but it was a delight, actually, to see all of the very wide references, including the dancing figure of architecture that we've had in Alireza's talk. So thank you for that. Now, I'm afraid we have to wrap up this session. I know it's a bit frustrating because we don't have time for the kind of discussion we would all love to have. And we're going to roll into the next segment of the talks, and then there's a chance for another panel session before, of course, the social aspect, where I'm sorry for the Americans and the other international audience who won't be with us. They can carry on with their sessions, and we can go and have all the discussions we like over some refreshments. So bear in mind that we don't have to fit in all the questions within our discussion period. So now session 2 is starting up.
Good evening. My name is Joanna Wachowiak, and I'm delighted to have a chance to speak to you. We all know that the places we love are more than just a mere collection of buildings where we live, sleep, rest, or work. They are full of character and meaning, much more than just some buildings. The meaning that they acquire through their development over time, layering which gives them richness and significance, which goes beyond pure mere aesthetics. When the places we live in become reduced to just the functional form, they often end up being alien and unsympathetic. They make people who live in them feel unhappy and disconnected from the past. And if there ever was a need to justify or support what I'm saying, we should go no further than look at Warsaw, which has already been mentioned. I obviously couldn't resist talking to you about it, as I'm Polish. Everybody knows that it has been rebuilt after the devastation of the war. But once you actually dive deeper into what happened, you understand what a perfect example it is to illustrate both the significance of the historic city and also the gift of imitation. Long before final devastation of Warsaw and destruction of Warsaw, which happened in 1944, Germans considered demolishing the city in order to substitute it with a much, much smaller town. The idea was to get rid of the capital and build a small administrative center for the occupied territories, which really would become a model city as well as a small transportation hub. This plan has never been realized. In 1944, Polish underground army staged an armed uprising in the face of incoming Soviet army. This was in itself a symbolic act. They wanted to liberate the city from Nazi occupiers, and they did not want to be liberated by the communists coming to them. Obviously, they were unable to win. Russians stopped before crossing the river and watched as the Wehrmacht squashed the uprising. So after 2 months, all the population was moved out of the city. And the images that, again, you probably all know of destroyed city are not simply a document which shows you what had to be done in order to squash the uprising. They actually are a result of a systematic destruction that has been decided as a punishment and in order to squash the soul of the country. So what happened, despite the fact that the Germans were at the time losing war, they organized special teams, which you can see the command structure going all the way up to Hitler. Himmler decided that no stone should be standing. Every building should be razed to the ground. And systematically, 80 to 90% of the buildings have been destroyed. Houses, theaters, nothing was left standing. So when the war ended, it's really not surprising that the idea of rebuilding the city, when looked at from purely economical point of view, didn't make much sense. However, people started to slowly go back to the city. And although they were being stopped at the entrances, it was not possible to stop them. They just came back and started to remove the rubble. Significantly, at the same time, Stalin realized that if he ever wanted to rule Poland, if he ever wanted to have a Soviet or communist government which will be treated seriously, it couldn't happen from anywhere else but from the place which was the capital. So once again, despite the fact that economically it made no sense, he ordered immediate reconstruction. And so, using the historic photographs, surveys, as well as paintings by Canaletto, Warsaw was rebuilt. And it was rebuilt as an act of defiance and victory, but significantly, from our point of view, it was also rebuilt to manifest the desire of the people to reconnect to the past, if not in the fabric of the city, at least in the form which was shaped by centuries of development, going back to the 13th century, by the connection to the locality and the place that Warsaw had next to the Vistula River. It manifested people's pride and something more than just place to shelter. What's worth remembering that while the reconstruction of the town squares and streets has been done to be as close as possible to what was there historically, there was another human instinct which was clearly irrepressible, that of creativity, invention, and desire to respond to changing needs. So the plans of the buildings were actually adjusted so that they responded to modern needs. Things like bathrooms were introduced. Some of the subsidiary structures within the courtyards have not been rebuilt in order to provide adequate ventilation and lighting and decongest the city from a very congested 19th century town. And I think once you understand how important the form of the town is and what meaning it carries, it's not surprising that the same consideration is given to what we do nowadays in our daily practice. When we design new settlements, extensions, or urban infills, our success very much depends on our understanding of the characteristics of the place, how they developed, and what makes them unique, so that when we actually do our designs, we can have them connected to the the specific past. We look at historic plots. We try to understand the form in which they developed. We try to understand what shaped them. Like in this example, we looked at the town of Wokingham, where silk trade was particularly important, and it had a great impact on what form the urban blocks had and how the architecture was then shaped. And then we try to use the same principles while designing our extension. We try to build places which are rooted in the past, but also create a base for future generations to come, so that we are on the continuum, giving people good environment to live in. We create new high streets, town squares, and village greens. And that's all I have to say.
Hello, I'm going to start just coming after such a moving story about Warsaw. I'm going to do something quite wicked and steal Nicholas's story about when Nicholas first, just a response to, when Nicholas was first taken to Warsaw years ago and shown around by a Polish intellectual, and hearing the story, then Nicholas apparently asked his friend of his, so hang on, a fifth of the population of Poland had been murdered, the country's economy had been destroyed, the whole society was in chaos, and you did the largest reconstruction project maybe any country has done in modern times. How did you afford it? And this man smiled slightly pityingly at Nicholas and said, Nicholas, that's such a Western European question. And that's true in a way, and yet also not the whole truth, because we see... I thought it was such a good moment for... And that, true in a way, and yet not the whole truth, because we do see, there were extraordinary reconstruction projects around Europe, and it does say something about the sacrifices people will make for the sake of home when their identity is really galvanized. So I'm Samuel Hughes. I'm, among other things, a researcher at the University of Oxford. I was asked, at one time, I was the research assistant of Roger Scruton on the Building Beautiful Commission, and Mark and Victoria asked me if I could say something about, Roger and classical architecture and about imitation, and I thought, well, what could I, what fit together? I thought maybe I would say something about this idea of the vernacular, which is very central in Scruton's aesthetics of architecture in particular. So, the vernacular, what is the vernacular? What do I mean by that? You can use the term vernacular in this way, like, some of you know R.W. Brunskill wrote that very nice book about. Brunskill's using the vernacular to mean like cottage architecture, sort of humble, pre-modern rural architecture, and he distinguishes it from polite styles like classicism or Gothic or modernism, or these kinds of... That's a perfectly legitimate way of using it. That's not the way Roger Scruton is using it when he writes about it, not the way I'm using it. I'm using it something a bit different, more like mass-produced versions of polite styles. Like they started in this is in Copenhagen, I think. They've started with a sort of Cinquecento palazzo architecture or something like that, and then they've turned it into this style that, like, as I say, I think that's Copenhagen, but that could be pretty much anywhere from Oslo to Sofia, pretty much any decade from 1850 to 1914. I mean, if you're a real specialist on European rental flats, to be able to tell much more than that. And all those, like, literally tens of millions of buildings that look like that, they'll look pretty good, right? It was very, very simple. They took these precedents, they converted into plaster, very simple facade pattern, and then they reproduced it huge numbers of times. Very unlikely to have been architect design. There were a few cities where architect design was normal for facades, like Paris, but most of them, just spec builder construction. That's the vernacular in the sense that I'm interested. This obviously is the most famous English vernacular in that sense, starting from, it was invented by architects in the 17th and early 18th century, based on Palladian precedents, abstracted, turned into this thing that was then reproduced hundreds of thousands of times by spec builders not exactly the same, with subtle variation, but with a very, very dependable, reproducible vernacular across England, across the 18th and into the 19th centuries. So I think the big claim I want to make is that the vernacular has a special place in architecture relative to other art forms. We often write the history of architecture in kind of like the way we write the history of painting and sculpture, music, literature, writing about the great works by the great architects. And it's a perfectly valid way to write architectural history, and for some purposes, that's the right way, and you can write very good art. But in some ways, it can also be misleading. So if you think like the top 100 classical composers probably wrote at least 95% of the classical music that you listen to, unless you have very refined tastes and you're particularly interested in one period or something. Overwhelming dominance. Something like that's true of literature. It's a little bit less true of painting and sculpture, but it's not so far off. And the nature of how those art forms can be reproduced is such that you can really hone in on that tiny minority of elite producers, and the studio art form can be, for the purposes of most people, the whole art form. Like, you probably almost never listen to something by a minor classical composer. That's profoundly untrue with architecture. If you took the 100 top architects, they produce a tiny minority of the buildings that you experience. And they probably produce, the building that matters most to most of us is our home. A few of you here might live in homes you've designed yourselves, so it's a slightly special case. But in general, none of us live in homes designed by great architects. We live in homes designed by very minor architects, or indeed by spec builders. And in this country, even today, we're told like 90% of new buildings have not seen the inside of an architect's studio. They're made by commercial builders who will be working in a hand-me-down style. They'll be working in a vernacular of some kind or another. So in the case of architecture, for many purposes, the vernacular isn't like a side concern, it's the central case, in the sense that it is the thing that matters most. And that distinguishes it profoundly from all the other studio arts and places it more in a category with dress or ceramics or these kinds of applied art forms. So what's the significance of that? What makes a good vernacular, or what makes a style into a good vernacular? And I think there's just a couple of things. Now, obviously, it's a bit of a cliche that traditional architects group gets together and complains about modernism. So I'm going to try and not do that and talk sort of examples taken from different traditional styles. One thing we might say about a style with a style that makes a good vernacular is that it has broad appeal. And this is just another general feature of architecture. People don't have a choice of whether to experience it. The vast majority of people who experience a building didn't pay for the building, didn't choose the building, just have to put up with the building. So that's fine if it's music. You can write music that nobody likes or only a few people like, and just those people will listen to it. In architecture, you have much broader social responsibilities, and that's especially true with this kind of vernacular architecture. It's everywhere architecture, totally pervasive, can't be avoided, totally So this is a building by Arthur Shoesmith, a follower of Lutyens in Delhi. My guess is probably, I like this building a lot, the church. I think probably most people in this room also, I suspect, like this building in a kind of highly abstracted version of Lutyens' classicism. You can see the connection to the war memorials and to the, his plan for Liverpool Cathedral. My guess is probably most of the general public would find this pretty heavy going, pretty gaunt, pretty bleak. They really wouldn't want to live in us. They want something which gives a little bit more, which is, doesn't demand such a sense of like, oh, I can see that of which this is an abstraction. Something which is a bit more easygoing, a bit friendlier, a bit more relaxed. And that, in a way, is not necessarily a criticism of Arthur Shoesmith. He did maybe his particular audience wanted that there. He did something that's good of itself, but it wouldn't make a good vernacular. It's not a good style for vernacularization. And for us, for the purposes of architecture, that's really important. That's a really important distinction. Here's another thing, another building connecting us to the general theme here, the idea of the other thing that a vernacularizable style needs to be is it needs to be easy to imitate. Right? The style that's good for imitation, and good for imitation by people who aren't great architects. It might be really bad architects or just spec. Now, this is a design by an architect called William Godwin for a house in Chelsea in the 1880s, an architect associated with what people called the aesthetic movement. My guess is it was controversial at the time and actually never got built in this form, because my guess is probably if you made it today, this probably would have quite broad appeal. I think people find it quite fun. What you couldn't do with this is make a style that you could, with any confidence, hand over to the spec builders. Right? It would be a disaster. And you look, it's like the facade composition is very, very careful and balanced. You really need quite refined taste to build something like that. The use of those kind of murals that are spreading across the facade in a way that doesn't clearly relate to the underlying facade pattern, or it does relate, but only if you have quite sensitive judgment about how the weighting of the murals, how of the aesthetic relationship between that and the fenestration and the massing, right? That's something that a very refined architect can do an interesting job with. That's not something that if you hand that over to Barrett or Persimmon, they'll produce a appalling kitsch or a total mess or what's obviously a bad. So again, a style which is nice as a studio art, nice as an occasional art for geniuses, is really, really bad for vernacularizable purposes. And that, I think, is one of the sort of background distinctions that we should have in mind. We used to be lucky in having styles that made really, really good vernaculars. And that maybe is the great distinctive claim of traditional architecture. There have been works of genius in every style, but the traditional styles of this country made a huge, great mass of things that were not works of genius and were not made by geniuses, but which were still good and which still made good places. And that, searching for the modern vernacular, searching for a vernacular that works for us, that seems like a very key project for us to be working on. And that theme of imitation, in that sense, is totally central to the practice of architecture today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samuel. And the advantage of having the line I prepared to say in response to Joanna's very moving talk is, of course, I saved precious minutes in not having to repeat it. But it is actually true. He also put his arm round me in a slightly patronising manner, but that doesn't matter. So my name is Nicholas Boyce-Smith. I'm the founding director, now chair of a social enterprise called Create Streets. I'm also chair of the government's new Office for Place. I'll just, for those of you who don't know internationally, I'll say a couple of seconds about what Create Streets does. We're not architects in the context of the conversation earlier. We do research into where people are happy in the built environment. We advocate for change. We support landowners and developers creating beautiful places. And we then are getting a lot involved in education of officials and indeed of young architects. And perhaps the answer to the discussion we were having earlier is, the answer isn't to be classical or be modernist or be anything else. It's how do we create places that support happiness and well-being and social connectedness and treading a little bit more lightly upon the planet. And I think that's the way to frame the debate rather than whether you should or shouldn't have Corinthian corbels. So we do that type of research. We then try and make that something that officials who are busy and politicians who are busy can comprehend. We use imagery to change the debate. This is some of the visions we did for an expanded Cambridge. And actually, almost by mistake, because I'm not an architect, as I say, I've set up a design studio, almost to fund it and also to bring it to life. So we do master plans for an increasing number of landowners in this country and internationally. Increasingly, we're writing design codes to help empower politicians and senior officials to actually link what's created to what is popular. And we think a lot about how you make places popular. We run lots of workshops. We use lots of visuals. This is some new homes we helped get planning permission for with overwhelming local support down in Devon recently. We have just written Surrey's new street design code with far more focus on walkability and street trees, and lots of regeneration strategies up and down the road. We've pioneered, well, not quite totally pioneered, but we certainly brought to popular appeal lots of visual preference surveys. We've this is a recent one we did on a viaduct near Birmingham, quite a clear result. We've got another one, actually, quite a prominent one, coming very, very soon. And we've evolved quite a specific and I hope very fair mechanism for doing that, essentially only changing one function in each visual preference that you compare on. And we run lots of workshops. That's one with our friend Francis Terry. And then we've developed our own online portal using above all these things, let it be known that he holds up his phone to crowdsource what people like. Ask simple visual questions. What's your favourite building? What's your favourite place in a town? Where do you like to walk? Where do you let your children run around without having you feel that you have to hold their hand? We're actually running one of the summer schools that Mark referenced, if anyone is interested, in Sherborne this July. And we're also actually starting to get involved, me particularly, in actually the history of our towns and places, and trying to link some of my work a long time ago as a historian with some of our research into where people are happy and why. So in the spirit of Nir Burras setting this off, do buy my book. It's about the history of London streets. Right, that's not what I'm going to talk about. This is what I'm going to talk about in the remaining probably minute I've got left. How do we rebuild our places? It's a theme we've touched on a lot over the last hour or so. And forgive me, I haven't been able to print out what I was saying, so I will have to look at my phone a bit. It's not that something more interesting has come up on WhatsApp. And I'm the son, the grandson, the great-grandson, the great-great-grandson, and so on for about 4 more generations of Anglican vicars. So for the first time in my life, I'm going to talk upon a text from the Bible. I've never done this before, but here it is. For they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. It hath no stalk, the bud shall yield no meal. If so be it yield, the strangers shall swallow it up. And the relevance of that will become clear. Over Easter, ladies and gentlemen, because I'm the father of teenage boys, I've been watching films about killing people, because that's what the fathers of teenage boys do. I've been watching Masters of the Air, which some of you may know is actually terribly upsetting, actually, about the sheer horror, not just that it was released on the poor devils on the ground, but of course on the poor devils who are dropping the bombs. And now that these are real people who did this, not the guys on TV, now that they're only actually a few years older than my own oldest son, I find it almost unbearable to watch, actually. The horror was both ways, not just on the poor residents of Warsaw, but actually on the poor people up above as well. And it does prompt a question, which we've touched on a bit already, which is, how do we rebuild? There is Dresden. How do we rebuild? How did we rebuild the towns? What was the philosophy? What was the thoughts that underpinned it? And I've got a book coming out looking at some of that, which I'm just going to start exploring some of the themes here. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are in London, here in the real world, at 8 minutes past midnight on the Saturday, the 7th September 1940. The first bomb of the Luftwaffe's continuous blitz fell at 43 Southwark Park Road there, just pretty much where just behind where that image is, or sorry, just in front of where that image is, and you can see the house isn't there. It was a grocer's shop. It wasn't actually badly damaged. 14 minutes after that, the very first London church lost to the Blitz, St Cyprian's on Adelaide Avenue, Brockley, was hit. Over the next 24 hours, 843 bombs were dropped on London. This is the working class docks and 2 up, 2 down London. This is actually opposite where that first bomb fell, and unlike that, it is still there. Over the next 9 months, London was bombed 71 times. One of the worst nights of bombing was the 29th and 30th December. I'm sure many of you have seen this picture. 130 bombers dropped 300 bombs a minute. St Paul's miraculously emerged unscathed, though a couple of bombs dropped in it and didn't blow up, in this famous and slightly doctored photograph by Herbert Mason. On the 16th of April of the next year, one of Christopher Wren's greatest churches, St James's Piccadilly, was gutted. The Doris James Lee's Mill, whom some of you may know, witnessed its ruin, and he wrote, "Cinders showered upon our hair, faces and clothes. On all sides columns of smoke sprang from raging fires, the glint of whose flames could be seen above the rooftops, trembling upon chimney stacks. I was reminded of Pepys's description of the Great Fire of London, the most malicious bloody flame, not like the flame of an ordinary fire." There it is, literally the next morning. This is an illustration from an unknown artist in an exhibition we're holding in our office on the bombing of London. So London, large parts of it, particularly the city, were destroyed. Nearly every building between Moorgate and Aldergate was razed. But of course, and now I come back to my text, the retribution was worse. Air Chief Marshal Harris, the head of Bomber Command, wrote in 1941, here's the source of that text, and he repeated it, or similar words to it in his subsequently published book. The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everyone else and nobody was going to bomb them. Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and 100 places, they put this rather naive theory into practice. They sowed the wind, and now they're going to reap the whirlwind. And I'm afraid poor old Germany certainly did. They dropped 30,000 tons of bombs during the Blitz. The 8th Air Force and Bomber Command proceeded to drop 500,000 tons during the rest of the war. And the destruction of German larger towns and cities is absolutely heartbreaking. 18 lost more than half of their buildings, and Hamburg, Mainz and Bochum lost more than 3/4, and that's, of course, without going beyond Germany. what to do, what phoenix should emerge from the ashes. Actually, I'll hold on that just for now. Now, in London, it was something people had already started looking at before the war. London was seen as too successful in the 1930s. So the Barlow Commission said it should stop growing out and should start growing up. And then war only added confidence to British planners' pronouncements. As you all know, this is the Plan Voisin for Paris in the 1920s. What you may not know, it certainly seems to be less well known, is it was actually funded by a car manufacturer, Gabriel Voisin. And Corbusier wrote, the technocratic elite, the industrialists, financiers, engineers and artists should be located in the city centre while the workers should be removed to the fringes of the city, which is charming. Here's the thing, is that Sir Patrick Abercrombie, the British planner, looking here, I think a little bit like Neville Chamberlain, he very much followed the spirit of this very dirigiste revolution in theory and tried to put it in practice. 5 enormous ringways, dozens of radials, mile upon mile, a quote, of the drab and dreary buildings in between should be cleared away with 500,000 people compulsorily moved to new satellite towns. As always, the poor would have the least choice, ladies and gentlemen. 40% of the residents of the East End were to be transported. A few monuments, a few historic villages such as Kensington would be allowed to remain in aspect. The men in Westminster, in Whitehall and County Hall were mesmerised. Now, and here's my point, and because again, I've probably only got about some minutes left. All the world had traffic modernism. All the world grappled with the question of how to manage the motor car and the growing cost of manual labour after World War I. But all of the world had architects and planners eager to start afresh. But what was not quite unique in Britain, but certainly at one end of the spectrum, was how few counterbalancing forces arguing for the maintenance of the street pattern and for the rebuilding and restoration of the buildings that were upon it. This is, ladies and gentlemen, the Chateau of Pierrefonds in France. I visited it almost by chance, actually, last year as a helpful stop-off place on a route. As you probably guessed, it's not medieval at all. It's almost entirely rebuilt by the great Viollet-le-Duc and then by Maurice Audereux. The entrance has a statue, there it is, of Viollet-le-Duc as a medieval craftsman. Now, obviously, this wasn't unknown in Britain. Lots of churches rebuilt. Perhaps the best comparison is the Marquis of Bute at Cardiff Castle. But those are all private. What was different in France was that this was funded by the state. And that meant that when the French started, and indeed much of the rest of Europe, to think about the rebuilding of Europe, first after World War I and then after World War II, the bureaucrats and the officials involved were as likely, I think in many cases more likely, to be influenced by this tradition than they were by what you might call the William Morris anti-scrape tradition, which I won't speak about now because we haven't really probably got the time. Hang on, I've lost my place here. It's very difficult if you lose your place. Here we are. So here is Bethune, which you may not have heard about. This was the command centre for the British Canadian Corps and the Indian Expeditionary Forces. It was incredibly badly shelled. About half was destroyed. I visited last year and I'm researching its history. It is astonishing how all the streets were put back, sometimes a little bit widened. Very often, buildings were clearly simulacrums or near simulacrums, but there many more weren't. So you get this glorious composition that both looks to the past and also looks to the future. Here is the Grand Place in Arras, fought over viciously. 3/4 of Arras was destroyed in World War I. All the buildings you see on the left-hand side and many on the middle and the right date from the 1920s. They're younger than my grandfather was. And then the buildings in it. There's a Hôtel de Ville, completely new. Every single building you see in that is about 100 years old. All right, now let's come back to Britain quickly, and I will end soon. So Britain didn't have the same tradition of state-led rebuilding, or certainly state-sanctified, and thus this is one of the best-selling books during the war, The Bombed Buildings of Britain, by an forgotten architect, largely forgotten, called J.M. Richards. He praised the aesthetic of destruction. The ruins were intensely romantic character. How could such honest stones truthfully be restored? And writers discovered in London's bombed-out rooms a quality that Kenneth Clark, the head of the National Gallery, called in itself picturesque, almost as if you're describing a Georgian folly. Now, weirdly, perhaps not that weirdly, I actually had a copy of this book as a child. My father had a copy, which I used to read. And hang on, there we go. The picture on the left was always the one I found most poignant. It's of Holland House, his library, one of England's great Jacobean houses, the day after it was hit, the house was hit, not just the library, by 22 incendiary bombs. And then on the right is the same room a few years earlier. But here's the thing. Holland House was listed, under the new listing system, not long after the war, as a partial ruin. If you tried to put it back today, you would probably not get planning or listed building consent. That the war romance in the ruin actually remains right now all the way through to what has and hasn't been listed. And then I will close in a moment, and that's what links us then back to continental Europe, because the argument against recreation, against restoration, Stephen's brilliant talk, was far more finely balanced in Europe than it was in England. Of course, there was de novo rebuilding. In a way, you couldn't, dare I say, have the money. It was just impossible to rebuild everything, but it was much more of a mix. So let's come back to the French. The reason I talk to French more than the Germans or the Polish is I speak French and I don't speak German or Polish, so it's easy to do this. This is Caen. I mean, almost destroyed by a combination of bombing and fighting in the Normandy campaign. My mother-in-law's family home destroyed in the rubble, something that before she went down with Alzheimer's, she still, up to a few years ago, found terribly upsetting. There is a picture of one of the abbey. But here's the thing, they've put the streets back. They haven't put it as well as they did in the war, in between the wars. The streets are there. Sometimes it's a sort of crude form of traditionalism. Sometimes it's straight modernism. Often it's reduced in height. But the city's still there. It's still walkable. And if at some stage in the future you wanted to grow it back again into a thing of beauty, you could. It is astonishing how much the East Europeans and the Russians put back. We've talked about that in the context of Warsaw. The Soviets did it to themselves. Leningrad, St. Petersburg, Hermitage, £200 of gold were used regilding it. 1,000 craftsmen working on it at one time. Repairs began on Leningrad as it was, St. Petersburg subsequently, in 1942, mainly completed in the 1970s, but the final one wasn't completed until 2003. So, literally continuously through the post-war period. And I think that's barely known in the English architectural debate. Sometimes there were ostentatious socialist reasons for putting back old buildings. This is Prague, which wasn't actually that badly damaged in the war. This is the Bethlehem Chapel. When I first read about it, I assumed it had been damaged and restored. Actually, it was pulled down, it was damaged by fire in 1786. And the reason they put it back was because it's where Jan Hus used to lecture, and he was seen as a proto-socialist. So it goes beyond actually just preparing the war. We talked about Poland, so I won't talk about Gdansk, and we've talked about Dresden, and I just want to finish with Dresden. You all know the awful story about Dresden. We were lucky enough at Create Streets, we were running a conference in Coventry, Dresden's twin city, a few months ago. In fact, Samuel was one of our speakers, and Samuel interviewed a very articulate and impressive young man, a member of the Dresden Historic Society, and he told the story of the rebuilding, which I won't repeat here because I think you know it, but I'll just perhaps touch on 2 points. The first, because we've talked about home and passion and love, is never forget that the Frauenkirche, it isn't a complete simulacrum, there are changes. There's a silver crucifix on the top, which was put there and designed, I should add, the second greatest country, or second largest country making donations to rebuild it, as you can probably guess, was the British. The silver crucifix on the top of that dome, ladies and gentlemen, was designed by the son of the lead bomb aimer of the, that might be quiet, of the lead bomb aimer of the bombers that flattened Dresden in 1945. And sometimes history takes a long time to come back to the right place, but I think in Dresden it is starting to. We ran the conversation with, I think I've got a photo of it, and I won't talk about Coventry. We ran the conversation with, that's Coventry, it's Twin City, which I think we can pass over with a polite lack of words. We ran the conversation with Leon over lunch informally, so people started drifting in as they'd got their sandwiches and got their lunch. To start with, this photo I took at the beginning, it was 50% full. You've got there the head of a local planning authority. You've got there the chair of Active Travel England. You've got there the head of planning for one of the volume house builders. By the time it finished, it was full. At one point, when he showed that slide, the room burst into spontaneous applause. And quite rightly, he was asked how popular is it with young people, and he said it was actually more popular. And as he put it in his words, for me, and I'm quoting Leon here, for me as a citizen of Dresden, walking through the historic centre today is like a dream come true. Dresden has its heart, its old town back. Even more should arise in the future. We're continuing our work to heal Dresden's wounded streets and bring them back to life. The restitching of Dresden is not complete, but it is underway. Thank heavens. Thank heavens indeed. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all our speakers. And, the great thing about organizing a conference is then you get to learn so much. So, it's fabulous. And they're all so different. And I thought we were just starting off with Imitation. And, we got so much more, I think. And so much human content, which I think is really what it's all about. So I should perhaps just say one thing, is that over in TAG, as in gathering, the day, if I got it right, is about bricks, right, and durability. And actually, this imitation thing does feed that. If it's the conceptual and intellectual and emotional cement, or it should be really lime-based mortar, that holds all of the durability together. So it's the other side to, if you like, the bricks, as in representing the physical fabric and technique. So we now need the second panel, and this time we have an advantage. We have a microphone spare. So the three speakers, Victoria and I will do the microphone moving around. Yes, so do the light. The light? Yep. Yes, well, you may be, but you need to be beamed. You need to be beamed and streamed. So,
I just want to ask. I mean, for me, it's been amazing to see all these examples of new architecture, sort of restorative architecture. What are your respective positions on things like, I don't know, soot washing or aging techniques or imperfections in new buildings in a traditional style, sort of blend them into the environment?
Well, quite honestly, I don't think there is any need to work very hard. They blend in all too fast. With the way the environment is, it takes no time whatsoever before your copper roofs become green. And the good news is the buildings that are properly detailed stain in a way which enhances them. So that's good as well. So quite relaxed.
Yeah, I'd say relaxed would be my word as well. Neither insist upon it, nor am horrified by it.
I think relaxation would be the thing of the day, since we're going to go on for a drink. But one of my points, I don't know if I actually got in the word relaxation, but I think, we can relax about this whole question of honesty and just claiming our sources and admitting we've derived it from there and all of that. That was part of that. And relaxing about these things. And I think the more that the people who do tradition can relax about the fact that that's what they do and just engage with people more generally and feel less, let's say, embattled, probably the better. So another question or observation or interjection? Georgia. Victoria's coming right.
I would like to note that all those presentations on panel 2 and also Stephen on panel 1 practically are emphasizing the thing that not only the authenticity of the fabric is important, but also other values and significance of the building. So the planners should be more attentive to the fact that feelings, attachment, the social value, the historical value, all those maybe in East Europe are stronger than in the West, and people are much more connected with their heritage and identity. Otherwise, I don't see any other reason for which they don't think so much to cost, but more for the symbolic value of the reconstruction. Do you agree, Joanna?
I don't think I would say that they are more significant for people in the East than they are in the West. I just think the response in terms of what happened in Poland, I showed you Warsaw, and there are other examples of towns which got rebuilt. There are other examples of towns which didn't and are not looking as wonderful as what I've been showing, and some of them are heartbreaking. You have a block of flats built in the center of medieval historic places. So I think the problem is that there is a sort of squeamishness which makes it difficult for people to accept that you just copying something that has been destroyed. And I think we should be relaxed about it. I think the value that we are actually getting from rebuilding the environment and recreating something that has been part of our past and allows us to then move on to the future, the continuity of which you talked, it's very significant, and that's important. I think it's more important than anything else. And I know that in Poland, the whole question of how to rebuild is still very urgent. There are places like Elbląg where the new ways of looking at trying to maintain the pattern of streets, but actually worrying about using precise historic detailing are still being lived out as we speak. So I think it's something that we just need to carry on working on and showing people that actually trying to stay connected with the past is nothing to be afraid of. On the contrary, we should promote it, because things that we can learn from the past, we can't just invent. It's too important to forget about it.
Yeah, I mean, one remark slightly in that connection. I think we'd all probably... I would say, at any rate, like, historic fabric does have some importance. So the Viollet-le-Duc view was, there's the value of fabric and there's the value of form or appearance, and the quantum of each varies from case to case. And if you're talking about like a prehistoric monument where, you know, it's like, I mean, certainly in a museum and you talk about pots or something, but even something like Stonehenge, like a fake simulation of Stonehenge might not have very much value. It's not actually particularly impressive. It's a particularly beautiful structure. The one really interesting thing about it is that it is extremely old, and so it has a sort of numinosity for us, and it stands for the continuity of human settlement in this country. Or when we're talking about like Dresden Cathedral, it's a building with enormous aesthetic and architectural value. And then when we're talking about the fabric of a city, we're not just talking about aesthetic and architectural value, but about like whether this place works for the people who live there, whether it's an adequate symbol for them of their community. So it varies a lot from case to case, but it's another one of those cases where architecture is a bit distinctive. Like the case for Reconstruction in architecture is generally stronger than the case for Reconstruction in lots of other art forms, because it has that like such close connection to everyday life, and like a good city matters to people so much, and matters to their well-being so much.
I'll say a couple of quick things. Thank you, Georgia. Very good question. And I should apologise to Georgia because she only got those slides from me about halfway through this afternoon, and I've made her life hell for the last week. So I hereby formally apologise in public. I remember on the very first, I've probably run hundreds of workshops with community groups and groups of neighbours up and down the country and internationally now. One of the very first ones I ran in Tottenham, a lady from I forget which West Indian island said that the way Tottenham Hale should be rebuilt, I remember very, very clearly, was with heart. That was the phrase she wanted a place with heart. The human, ironically, the human desire, need for home, for places with a sense of the local and the particular, is perversely ubiquitous. We all, or nearly all of us, feel that need, and you can see that in the polling as well as in the conversations. It's probably something we feel a bit more as we get older. So the longer we have lived in a place, the more memories it has for us. Sometimes not even good memories actually give a place value. That's why the elderly widow or elderly widower doesn't want to move out of the perhaps now overlarge home that her children grew up in, or when her husband or wife has died from. So there's a reason for that. It's human, it's normal. I don't think that is more in the East or more in the West. It is slightly less true of more prosperous people who move around more. So there are some slight trends in the data, but they're very, very modest. Nearly all of us need home, and the purpose of architecture and urbanism, I only got 2 minutes apparently, according to that. I thought I had about 5 seconds. It should be to create them and allow them to grow into the future.
Right, and I was just going to interject that I'm not part of the speaking panel, but I think one of the answers to Georgia's question is also the success of business and corporations in Western, well, like Britain and other, if you like, Western countries as opposed to Eastern Europe. And Nicholas reminded us of this with the Voisin plan and the connection with who commissioned it, with a motor manufacturer. And I think just the amount of commercial interest in change and novelty just can't be underestimated. Because, of course, every time you buy a new set of clothes, a new car, a new house, you change things, that is money being made. That is business, and you know that's huge. So Victoria, but we did have Alireza wanting to ask a question, and can we fit it in before we?
We have a question from the online audience.
We have a. Do we allow that in this? In this?
Depends what the question is. Is it a good question or a bad question?
A good question.
Well, I think we seriously don't have the time, with all due respect. Once we open the doors to the online, I'm sure we'll do by all means complain to the management. But I think we can't allow that because, or rather we could to our own TAG UK audience, because at this point I think we have to hand over and close as far as TAG-24, TAG Gathering International goes, because they are scheduled to restart with their own, with the other sessions, I believe. Is that correct? Yes. So I think if we say goodbye from London to everyone else, and it's been an absolute pleasure and an honour to be, let's say, on show for you guys out there, we'll say goodbye, and then we'll carry on entertaining ourselves over here. So over and out. Goodbye.